Hey everyone, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from 1619 by James Horn, and we're reading Chapter 3, First Africans. About the same time, Sir George Yeardley was preparing for his first meeting of the General Assembly. Two heavily armed English privateers lay windward of a Portuguese slave ship in the Gulf of Mexico. The privateers were the Treasurer, owned by Sir Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, and captained by Daniel Elriff, then the White Lion, commanded by Cornishman John Job. Their meeting may have been by chance, but such associations were common. English privateers often joined forces to cruise the waters of the Caribbean in search of prizes. The slave ship of St. John the Baptist, commanded by Captain Manuel Mendes de Cunha, had departed Luanda, the capital of Portuguese Angola, earlier that summer, carrying approximately 350 African captives bound for Veracruz, Mexico. As was common with slave ships, she was grossly overcrowded, which, together with a shortage of supplies and drinking water, resulted in appalling conditions on board and the deaths of approximately a third of the Africans en route. In late July or early August, the White Lion and Treasurer closely closed in on their prey off the Yucatan coast and engaged in the fierce battle that left all three ships damaged. Job and Elriff took approximately 55 to 60 Africans as a prize and left the battered Portuguese slaver to her fate, setting their course for Virginia, where they anticipated on taking provisions and selling the Africans. Piracy was practically the only means by which the English could acquire or trade African slaves in this period. Spanish officials claimed all of the New World as their own and refused to recognize the legitimacy of foreign colonies or allow foreign merchants to traffic in America. For their part, English sponsors of privateering voyages denied Spanish territorial claims and disputed their right to exclude them from sailing the high seas and trading wherever they wished. Warwick, for example, had sent ships from Bermuda and Virginia over the course of several years to rode in the West Indies in search for treasure or trade. He was only the most recent of a long line of Englishmen stretching back more than half a century to the days of John Hawkins, Francis Drake, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who had profited enormously from pillaging Spanish ships and American settlements. Since mid-16th century mariners, together with the English lords and merchants who had sponsored them, were well aware of the huge number of Africans taken forcibly as enslaved laborers to work on the cane fields or on the wharves of the bustling ports or the silver mines of Spanish America. Turned to pieces by the Portuguese traders who had been trafficking along the west coast of Africa since the mid-15th century, English mariners also viewed sub-Saharan Africans as slaves and had few qualms about treating them as valuable form of plunder. The White Lion was the first privateers to arrive in Virginia. About the latter end of August, John Rolfe reported to Sir Edwin Sandys, a Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tons, arrived at Point Comfort. Commander's name Captain Job. His pivot for the West Indies, one Dr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met the Treasurer in the West Indies, and determined to hold consortship hitherward, but in their passage lost to the other one. He brought nothing but 20-odd negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals, of which he was in need, at best the easiest rates they could. The Dutch man of war referred to as Rolfe was the White Lion, sailing under a letter of marque from the Viceroy Flushing in the Netherlands that gave Captain Job permission to attack and rob Spanish ships and possessions. Spanish authorities dismissed the legitimacy of such letters and considered privateers no better than pirates. But the letters of the Marquis were recognized by several European states hostile to Spain as a means of promoting tax on Spanish shipping. Job's papers from Valenciennes may account for Rolfe identifying the White Lion as Dutch, or he may have had his own reasons to obscure the ship's true name and English origins. In any event, Rolfe is clear that Sir George Yeardley and the company's Cape merchant Abraham Pearsley traveled down to meet the ship at Point Comfort near Keokton, which suggests they knew about the Africans aboard. It is no coincidence that a few years later, the two of them were recorded in a census as owning the majority of the captives. 20 and odd were the first documented Africans to arrive on the mainland of English North America. Shortly after, the treasure anchored off Point Comfort, but did not stay long. Again, Rolfe provided an account of what happened. 3 or 4 days after the treasure arrived, at his arrival he sent word presently to the governor to know my pleasure, who wrote him, and did not request myself, Lieutenant Pierce, and Mr. Edwins, to go down to come up to James City. Before we got down there, we had set sail and got off the bay. The occasion hereof by unfriendly dealing of inhabitants of Cegdron was in great want and victuals, where they relieve him or his company of any terms. The real reason why Captain Ellsworth left so abruptly, as Rolfe knows, was because Governor 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘯𝘴 had received instructions from Sir Edward Sandys in London to detain the ship and question Ellsworth about his involvement in an act of piracy in the Spanish Indies sponsored by his patron, the Earl of Warwick. Sandys' determination to prevent privateers using Virginia as a base to mount raids on the Spanish West Indies reveals a serious rift in the Virginia Company's leadership. He disagreed profoundly with Warwick about the role English colonies should play in the New World. Sandys' plans centered on the creation of a settler society in Virginia, and that would benefit from forward-looking governmental, religious, and economic policies. Warwick favored establishing societies as Bermuda that would profit from commerce and privateering. Had Sandys subscribed to Warwick's view, far more Africans would have likely arrived in Virginia in these years. Despite his rapid departure from Point Comfort, however, circumstantial points to Ellsworth or selling some exchange of the Africans before leaving port, just as 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘳𝘴 and Piercy had brought most of the Africans from 𝘕𝑙𝑃 a week or so earlier. Captain Pierce and Captain Evans set down river from Jamestown by the governor to meet the treasurer. Also, later had a couple of Africans in their household. It seemed clear that more Africans had arrived in the colony in early September 1619 than 20 or so reported by Rolfe, including a woman named Angela, who in the mid-1620s was living in Pierce's household. After leaving the Chesapeake Bay, Ellsworth set his course for Bermuda, where he would meet with a friendlier reception from officials aligned with the Earl of Warwick than he had received in Virginia, and treated 29 Africans in return for provisions. There, Africans were held under lock and key before being sold or put to work by the governor Nathan Butler on lands belonging to the Bermuda Company. In poor condition, the treasurer remained in port and did not set sea until February 1620, when she returned to Virginia with a few English passengers and about half a dozen Africans on board. After arriving in the colony and dispossessing of her passengers, the ship rotten and seaworthy sank or was scuttled in the creek off James River. These Africans, together with the 20-odd others purchased from the treasurer previously in store, made up about 32 Negroes listed in a colony-wide census the following month. New evidence has recently come to light that offers a clearer understanding of the origin of the first Africans being forced to board the St. John the Baptist. They were not already enslaved workers who had been living in the Spanish Caribbean, as some historians previously surmised, but came from the West Central Africa, most likely the Christian kingdom of the Congo, and neighboring province of Ngando. We now know that they had been captured by the Portuguese during a period of intense warfare and arrived in the colonies as slaves. In the early 17th century, West Central Africa was a highly diverse region politically and culturally that stretched about 500 miles along the Atlantic coast, from the Kingdom of Loango and the Congo River in the north to Bengola and the Guinea River Valley in the south. Inland, extending several hundred miles, the region embraced broad coastal lowlands, fertile river valleys, and massive highlands into the interior, rising over 4,000 feet in places. Congo, a large centralized kingdom, dominated the region. Its core was the densely inhabited lands along the Congo River, valley, and highlands in the interior around the capital. But during the 15th and early 16th century, its borders expanded considerably to embrace smaller states to the east, as long as the coast far south the island port of Luanda. Across the same period, other powerful kingdoms emerged, such as Luanga northward beyond the Congo River, bounding the coast, Luanga far to the south, and Luanga, from which the name Angola is derived, Angola, that included the rising of the Ngando in the highlands. Portuguese traders first arrived on Congo's coast in the 1480s. sparking a remarkable and lengthy period of cultural exchange. Congo was a well-established and powerful kingdom, with its rulers actively encouraged close relations with the Portuguese on equal terms in mutually beneficial commerce and access to European technology and knowledge. Within a generation, the Congolese had espoused their own distinctive form of Catholicism, constructed churches, established schools to encourage literacy among the elite, and entered into diplomatic dealings with the Portuguese. Lesser states as Uganda and provinces of the south were inclined to be more cautious, fearing subjugation and conquest by the Europeans, but nevertheless favored alliance with the Portuguese to buttress their military strength and independence. One common objective of paramount importance shared by the Portuguese and the African traders alike through West Central Africa was the opportunity to profit from the immensely lucrative slave trade. The slave trade drew the Portuguese into ever closer relations with African rulers all along the west coast, and for their part, Africans were drawn more and more into the Portuguese orbit of the Atlantic commerce. The capture and sale of human beings was not introduced by Europeans. It was embedded in certain African cultures and consequently had a long history, but alliance with Portuguese merchants greatly expanded and extended the slave trade, bringing riches to ruling kings and merchants alike. In the early 16th century, Congo was exporting 2,000 slaves annually, primarily to southern Europe and 𝘊𝘪𝘳𝘴𝘵, Portugal's Atlantic island off the equatorial coast of Central Africa, where rapid growth of sugar production relied on slave labor. By 1600, the number of enslaved workers sent from Angola to the Americas and outward eventually had more than doubled. Little wonder to promote their own interests to trade, the advanced military alliance the rulers of Nagando, Bangula, and Lugando especially established their own relationships with the Portuguese. These partnerships were advantageous at first, but would also prove disastrous. For a close century, relationships between the Portuguese settlements and the African kingdoms in the region, notably Congo, were based on reciprocal benefits. But in 1571, Sebastian I, King of Portugal, abruptly switched policy and commanded his military forces in Angola to carve out a discrete Portuguese colony from Nagando and the bordering areas to the south that would be ruled directly by the crown. The new territory would become known as Portuguese Angola. King Sebastian justified this dramatic change in a direction by his sincere wish to promote the holy faith and holy evangelization, although profiting further from the slave trade was also likely on his mind. The brutal military campaigns over the next 20 years undermined the Ngango kingdom and paved the way for subsequent ruinous wars of the 17th century. The immediate background of the capture of men and women who ended up enslaved in Virginia was the appointment of 𝘊𝘪𝘳𝘴𝘵 as governor of Angola in 1617. After conventional European tactics failed to achieve military victory, he enlisted the companies of 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘢𝘀, called Yagas, ruthless mercenaries who band together in their thousands to plunder one area after another. Originating in the highlands of Angola in the last quarter of the 16th century, they spread terror and misery throughout the region by their indiscriminate killing, rape, and cannibalistic rituals. Following the incursions by the Imbagala fires, whole provinces were left devastated. Fields and valuable palm trees were ruined, livestock killed, villages plundered, and people murdered and enslaved. Portuguese clerics and missionaries looked upon with shock. Instead of shunning the Yagas, Bishop Manuel Batista Sordas only complained to Spain's Philip III that in 1619 the governor Menendez had forged alliance with him, killing innumerable innocent people, not only against the law of God, but only against the express regulations of Her Majesty. During Menendez's decisive campaigns of 1618 and 1619 in Nagando, Portuguese and the Imbagala forces completely overwhelmed Nagando's defenses and quickly captured the capital, Cabasa. Both the city and the region's rich agricultural lands were plundered mercilessly, so people were slaughtered. A contemporary wrote that the rivers became spoiled with the huge numbers of people enslaved without cause. Most of those people captured by the Portuguese were from large towns, heavily populated rural communities in the Royal District and the Cabasa between the Luca and Lute rivers. Mendez's Angola conquista was likely the origin of many of the enslaved men and women who ended up in Virginia and Bermuda. And if so, John Thornton suggested captives from Kambasa and surrounding areas would have a strong sense of their own cultural identity. They spoke a common language, 𝘊𝘪𝘳𝘴𝘵, came from an area where they strong allegiance to a king and his court, held religious or spiritual beliefs, and had survived the same hardships of war and capture. It is also possible that some of these enslaved who eventually landed up in English America came from the areas closer to Luanda or from ancient reefs of the Congolese capital. Salvador, where Portuguese forces in the Mbanga wreaked havoc in 1618-1619. This kind of chaos was advantageous to the Portuguese, who were able to enslave victims caught up in wars at the same time consolidate their hold on the region. For enduring terrible conditions, captives were tied together in long lines and forced to trek hundreds of miles from the interior to the Atlantic coast and Luanda. The sheer number of new captives overwhelmed port authorities in 1618-1619, and thousands had to be held in slave pens that surrounded the town or kept on beaches, waiting to be put on board the ships. This was generally the moment when priests would teach rudimentary principles of Christianity to those not already Catholics. But it was hard to imagine that religion instruction offered much comfort to enslaved men and women who viewed the impending horror of the voyage as a form of prolonged death committed by the Portuguese witches, who might eat them or take them to the land of the dead, the Americas. Some died of starvation and sheer fatigue before boarding. Many others perished on the ships waiting to leave port, or those during the dreadful months of the crossing. 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘯𝘴 de Salvador, who wrote about the experiences of the enslaved in this period, observed that captives were chained together when boarding to prevent them from escaping or throwing themselves over the side. At sea, they were chained in long rows from head to foot below, where they saw neither sun or moon. Apart from they were allowed on the deck periodically in small groups for fresh air. Slave ships were frequently grossly overcrowded and did not carry adequate provisions and drinking water for the journey. An account of a former slave, 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘢𝘴, taken from West Africa, Nigeria, in the mid-18th century, provides a graphic illusion of the experience endured by millions of Africans forced to take the Middle Passage. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so entirely loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. But now the whole ship's cargo was confined together, and it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the pace and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. They produced copious perturbations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smell and brown of sickness among slaves, which many have died. The wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains now becoming insupportable, and the filth of necessary tubes, in which children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of women and the groans of the dying rendered a whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘢𝘴 described a small litany of beatings, acts of such cruelty, and deaths of Africans throughout the voyage. In 1619, 36 slave ships left Luanda for Brazil and Spanish America, one of which was St. John the Baptist. During a passage of 11 to 12 weeks, the death rate on the ship was typically between a fifth and a third of the captives. Tragically, the loss of 120 of the 350 slaves on Captain Kahuna's ship by the time she reached Veracruz was by no means accidental, and more Angolans likely succumbed to the disease or exhaustion soon after arrival. By the time first Africans arrived in Virginia, 500,000 slaves had already been shipped across the Atlantic to work in Spanish America and Brazil, the majority taken as captives in the vicious wars fought by the Portuguese in Angola. Hispanic attitudes towards Africans, especially those from sub-Saharan regions, and their development of an Iberian slave trading system would play a formidable role in shaping the English approaches to enslaving Africans from Virginia to Barbados. 17 women and 15 men from Nango or Congo, here they are referred to as Angolans, lived in Virginia in early 1620. They were described, together with 4 Powhatans, as simply others not Christians in the service of the English, and Negroes in the service of several planters, with no further details. 4 years later, only 21 Angolas were recorded. Half of them were residents at the 𝘊𝘪𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘢, a large plantation owned by Abraham Pearsley, on the south side of the James River, a dozen miles from Jamestown. The following year, another map provides more details. 23 Angolans were listed, 7 at Pearsley's plantation, made up of 4 men, 2 women, and a baby, all unnamed and described as Negroes. At Jamestown, 8 were listed living in Sir George Yeardley's household, again, all unnamed, 5 Negro women and 3 Negro men. Angela, the Negro woman who had arrived in the treasurer, lived in the house of William Pierce. Nearby, Edward worked on Richard Kingsmill's plantation in downriver at 𝘊𝘧𝘳𝘪𝘤𝘢 in the Puritan Edward Bennett's house. 2 Africans remained, Antonio and Negre, who was reported arriving in the James in 1621, and Mary, who came on the Margaret and John in 1622. At Elizabeth City, Anthony and Isabella had a child named William after their master, Captain William Tucker, who was baptized at the small church near the plantation. Finally, also living in Elizabeth City was an African, possibly Angolan, named John Pedro, who was described as 30 years old and having arrived on the Swan in 1623. He lived in the household of Captain Francis West on the company's land in Elizabeth City, close to the mouth of the James River. Several points stand out in these lists of enslaved. In 1620, 32 Angolans were recorded in the colony, all from St. John the Baptist, representing approximately 3.5% of the total settler population. However, 5 years later, only 23 were listed and less than 2% of the population, which there was at least 3 new arrivals and 2 had been born in the colony. Clearly, the arrival of the first group of Africans did not lead to a surge of slaves into the colony. Second, if the figures were reliable, it is likely that as many as 14 had died by 1625, approaching half of the initial group. Virginia experienced especially high mortality rates, white and black alike, during this period, owing to the poor health of many newcomers following the Atlantic crossing, and the spread of contagious disease brought from England and the massive Indian attack of 1622. Bush alone accounted for the deaths of approximately 350 settlers. Having been forcibly taken from their own war-torn land by a malign twist of fate, Angolans found themselves in another country ravaged by war and famine. The emotional and psychological impact of their loss of their compatriots and finding oneself once again in the midst of conflict is hard to imagine. The census also tells us that from the outset, ownership of Africans was dominated by wealthy settlers who controlled large plantations, held important official positions, and consequently acquired the majority of the captives, in which few expectations held onto them. Most of the enslaved Angolans lived in households that included between 4 and 10 other slaves. Governor Yeardley and Abraham Pearsley owned the majority listed in 1624 and 1625, but the remainders were purchased by other high office holders, burgesses, and wealthy merchants such as Pierce, Bennett, and Tucker, a trend that would continue thereafter. Even at this early stage, Africans were considered especially valuable, more so than servants or tenants. These slaves, Governor Nathaniel Butler Bermuda wrote in January 1621, referring to the arrival of 14 Africans on the island the previous year, are the most proper and cheap instruments for this plantation that can be. Few in Virginia would have disagreed. The individual experiences of the Angolans would have varied enormously depending on their masters or overseers, where they resided, and their particular nature of work. Richard Ligon's description of Barbados, a couple of decades later, in relation to planters' treatment of white servants, is more applicable to the enslaved Africans of Virginia. How servants fared, he wrote, whether the master is merciful or cruel. Those that are merciful treat their servants well, both in their meat and drink and lodging, and give them such work as is not unfit for Christians to do. But if the masters be cruel, the servants have a very wearisome and miserable lives. Africans were involved in all aspects of plantation work, raising tobacco and corn, tending cattle and other livestock, looking after the kitchen garden, and fixing fences and outhouses. For those who lived in rural communities in Congo or Ngongo, their aspects of the New World, Virginia, such as looking after cattle, may have been similar to the work they had done in their homelands, but those who had come from cities had formerly worked in skilled trades likely found themselves reduced to common laborers unless they were able to adapt their skills to the master's demands. Unlike white maidservants who usually did not work in the ground, African women were routinely put to heavy labor and frequently labored alongside men in the fields, as well as doing arduous domestic chores such as pounding corn. To encourage productivity in corporations, and whereas some were given the opportunity to work on a small plot of land for themselves and for profit, and thereby eventually purchase their freedom or that of their children from their owner. But the majority of the Africans in the colony were treated as perpetual slaves. Most Africans resided in the main dwelling house among the planter's family and white servants, typically in a loft or in a cellar where they could find space. In a couple of cases, they lived in large groups, but they may have cooked and slept in the planter's outbuildings close to the dwelling houses. For those residing on the Yeardley, Piercy, Bennett, and Captain Tucker's plantation, there would have been plenty of opportunity to spend time with other Africans and possibly for couples to live and have children, such as in the case of Anthony and Isabella at Tucker's plantation. In contrast, for Angela, Edward, and John Pedro, the sole Africans in their respective households, living in Virginia may have been initially a lonely experience. Periodic visits to neighboring plantations, if permitted, would have been sufficient to keep in touch with their compatriots. Living with the immediate company of other Africans may have encouraged them and forced them to integrate more quickly with their white family and neighbors. Considered the majority of Angolans resided in households that included 3 or more Africans, they may have been able to keep at least some of their cultural traditions, such as language, regional customs, and spiritual beliefs. They spoke to each other in Kimbudu, or from the Congo, the related Bantu language of that kingdom, Kikongo. These from Congo may have shared in their form of Catholicism. In some areas where the Congo, where trade with the Europeans were common, they adopted varying degrees of the Portuguese language, names, food ways, and manners. Those from Nagano, on the other hand, likely retained religious beliefs that connected it to continuous dialect of their ancestors and spirits who inhabited the other world. It is somewhat possible restrained beliefs in night flying, during which the person's spirit wandered freely at night and might occasionally return across the ocean to Angola. The question of whether Africans were enslaved when they first arrived in Virginia or treated similarly to white servants who made up the bulk of the colony's labor force down to the 1670s had generated a great deal of controversy among historians. Did slavery and racial prejudice gradually evolve in Virginia during the half-century following the arrival of Angolans, or did de facto enslavement of the Africans begin in 1619? Advocates in favor of the gradual emergence of slavery, with forms of the initial black servitude, have emphasized that Virginia lacked any laws clearly defining and providing legal sanctuary for slavery. Laws in Virginia that unquestionably indicated a lifelong service for all African laborers, not just those who had run away from their owners, did not enter state books until the 1660s and 1670s. In addition, some historians point out that the evidence of the nonchalant of the Africans who arrived in the White Lion or the Treasurer, who entered the colony later in the 1620s or after, were termed slaves. In fact, rather than being identified as slaves, they were listed in the muster of 1625 along white servants. Even by 1649, John Ferrer would write that there are in Virginia about 15,000 English, and of Negroes brought hither 300 good servants. Perhaps the most telling evidence employed by some of those who make the theory of the evolution of slavery of those Africans who against all odds escaped bondage and established themselves as free planters on the eastern shore of Virginia in the 1660s and the 1670s. For example, 13 were listed as free householders, and nearly a fifth all Africans there. The best known is Anthony Johnson, possibly the same Angolan known to us as Antonio, who was listed on Edward Bennett's plantation in 1625. If so, he apparently married Mary, a Negro woman who had lived on the same plantation from 1623. 15 to 20 years later, and still enslaved, they moved with their children into the late 1630s and early 1640s to a plantation in North Hampton County on the eastern shore of Virginia. Over the next couple of decades, the Johnsons achieved their freedom and acquired substantial property, including enslaved Africans. In the mid-1660s, Anthony, Mary, and their extended family moved farther north to Somerset County on the eastern shore of Maryland, where Anthony died short after. The possibility that Anthony Johnson was one of the first Africans from the St. John the Baptist is clearly evidenced by Johnson's son, John, naming a plantation he bought some years later, Angola. Those Africans who were able to free themselves and their families in this period were extraordinary, yet their experiences contrast starkly with the lives of the vast majority of Africans brought to the America, including the first Angolans. As already noted, the English inhabited the Atlantic world, where the enslavement of Africans by Europeans was unremarkable. Lagos, Portugal, was Europe's first African slave trade port, and had prospered greatly since the mid-1440s thanks to the profits. Even before the trade to America began, thousands of slaves passed through the town slave market on their way to Lisbon and Seville. On the arrival of hundreds of slaves in Lagos in 1444, Prince Henry the Navigator, brother of the Portuguese king, commented that he had no other pleasure than in thinking that these lost souls would now be saved. Papal bulls issued by the Catholic Church sanctioned the enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans and legitimized the trade as a part of their holy mission to convert the heathen. Precisely the same reasoning employed to justify the Spanish conquest of the America and enslavement of Indian peoples, in asserting a religious justification for slavery. Historian James Sweet remarks the Portuguese and Spanish avoiding subjugating the practice of debate. From their point of view, slavery was a small price to pay for Africans in return for their immortal souls. It is true that indigenous forms of slavery had not existed in England for centuries. Serfdom in villages, feudal land systems whereby men and women were bound through descent to particular lordships and manors persisted, but impacted only a small and rapidly decreasing minority of people. The wide-ranging economic changes that had swept across much of the lowland countryside, the late 15th and 16th century, were unconducive to the persistence of servitude labor, or bondmen. In many cases, labor requirements were commuted to particular fees and annual payments. Yet if slavery had long since departed their own shores, English people were aware of the great forms of non-freedom that had and still existed throughout the world, such as various types of apprentices taken by contract, penal servitude, tales of Christians taken by Muslim pirates, forced to become galley slaves, or in the Bible, which was full of references to the enslaved peoples. Increasingly, too, the English were becoming aware of the vast numbers of Africans being shipped to America and other parts of Europe. Although it was with pride that the English considered themselves a uniquely free people, they lived in a world where the mass enslavement of Africans was resurgent. English people's attitudes toward the relatively few Africans living in England in this period was unclear. Free and enslaved Africans resided in cities in the major ports such as London, Plymouth, and Bristol, and worked in a wide range of occupations among lower and middling ranks of society, although some were highly accomplished and educated in specific occupations. Small numbers also inhabited towns and parishes throughout the realm, where they seemingly lived alongside their neighbors with no obvious sign of white prejudice. Only at the end of the 16th century, possibly as a result of blackamoors, people of color, usually from North Africa, into London, was there any alarm expressed about the number of black residents in Britain, and even in this case appears the government was far more concerned about the possible threats to public order than were English people. By contrast, depictions of sub-Saharan Africans in travelers' accounts were popular praise and percentage tend to be extremely negative. They were people of a beastly living, without a god, a law, religion, or a commonwealth, wrote Captain John Locke on his voyage to Guiana in 1554, adding descriptions of the black-skinned peoples that were barely human, if human at all. Other writers described Africans as wild and savage peoples, some of whom were cannibals, accustomed to the man's flesh, ludicrous of apes. Having translated an account of Africa by 16th century Spanish Moroccan Moor Leo Africanus, John Porey was likely the most knowledgeable man about Africans in Virginia, and may have agreed with Africans' assessments of Africans being utterly destitute of the use of reason, destitute of wit, and of all arts. If English people showed little inclination to discriminate against Africans in their own communities, nevertheless Europeans' general view of Africans in Africa, especially of South Africa, was south of the Sahara, was bleak. The coerced transportation of Africans to America was a major component of the Atlantic commercial world from its beginning, a key driver to the Atlantic system itself. Enslaved Africans were treated as commodities, as a particular type of property. John Hawkins, one of the first English traffickers of slaves from Africa to the West Indies, for example, commented that the Negroes were good merchandise in Hispaniola, and the store of Negroes might easily have been upon the coast of Guiana. English mariners and merchants involved in the Atlantic slave trade recognized the complexity of relationships with Africans along the coast of West and Central West Africa, which frequently involved dealing with sophisticated African rulers or merchants to acquire captives for shipment, and took for granted African traders' designation of black captives as slaves. Enslaved markets of Africa, Portugal, and Spain, as in the Atlantic and American colonies, African captives' classification as the chattel slaves, whether by Europeans or African merchants, determined their fate and that of their offspring in perpetuity. Such was the chilling effect of the transatlantic slave trade in African men, women, and children. Okay.